Yo, what is up, guys? Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully, you guys are doing well. If you're new here, smash that like, hit subscribe, all of that good stuff. So, some news coming out of the heavyweight division. The return of Andy Ruiz Jr. has now been announced. It has been officially confirmed, and he is returning on the 24th of April against Chris Arreola. Now, before I get into this, I have to say, given the fact that Andy Ruiz Jr. is coming off a loss, more than a year outside the ring, changing trainer, I've got no real problem that he's taking on this sort of opponent in Chris Arreola. Of course, Chris Arreola a few years ago was somewhat of a contender in the heavyweight division, but these days, of course, Chris Arreola is well past his best, been through a lot of wars, and obviously he's getting on in age. Ordinarily, I wouldn't have a problem with Andy Ruiz Jr. taking on this sort of opponents, given the circumstances of where he's at right now. However, according to Boxing Scene, this fight is actually going to be on pay-per-view in America on Fox. Now, of course, that doesn't affect me as a UK fan. I can see this fight for free, I'm assuming. So that doesn't affect me in regards to the price point. But regardless, we're all in this together as boxing fans. This fight is not worth paying for. That level of opponent for Andy Ruiz Jr. is not good enough when we're talking in the context of pay-per-view. If Andy Ruiz was fighting on regular Fox and this was a comeback fight, no problem whatsoever on my end. But when you're having a pay-per-view fight, surely Andy Ruiz Jr. has to be doing better than Chris Arreola, for Christ's sake. I mean, Chris Arreola these days is not even a top 20, top 25 heavyweight, you would say. And bear in mind, after his defeat to Adam Kownacki, I believe back in 2019 in August, he said he was going to retire after that fight. So Chris Arreola's not been seen since then, and he's ending up on pay-per-view. It's a bit of a joke, I have to say. And I don't think this really is a good look for Andy Ruiz Jr. After the Joshua fights, I'm certain his popularity has skyrocketed. A lot more people now are aware of who Andy Ruiz is, and he's really going to be, banking on that Spanish audience to view his fights. I think the best course of action would have been to fight Chris Arreola on regular Fox, hopefully look good, and, Andy Ruiz now on regular Fox, I'm assuming will do pretty good numbers, especially fighting Chris Arreola, who's also a Hispanic. And that fight in general, in my opinion, would have done solid viewing figures on regular Fox. And, providing Andy Ruiz Jr. looked good, I think that would be a good look, in all honesty, especially given that he's now training with Eddie Reynoso. They could market it as a new beginning. Apparently, Andy Ruiz Jr. is losing a boatload of weight. It would have been perfect to showcase this guy on Free Fox. But putting Andy Ruiz Jr. versus Chris Arreola on pay-per-view in 2021 is absolutely ridiculous as far as I'm concerned. If you're talking about Andy Ruiz Jr. in a pay-per-view fight, we're talking about guys like Deontay Wilder. And, even someone like Luis Ortiz would be decent in my opinion. But Chris Arreola? Are you serious? Come on now, what's Al Heyman thinking? Jesus Christ. Just a poor move in my opinion for the popularity of Andy Ruiz Jr. Because like I say, behind a paywall, I can't really see this fight doing all that well in terms of buys. But there we go. But the fight itself, man, it is what it is. It's a comeback fight. It's a tune-up fight. And let's be honest, it's a fight in which is designed to make Andy Ruiz Jr. look good. On paper, Chris Arreola, especially these days, should do that. So all in all, this fight should not be on pay-per-view. I know I'm banging on about it, and I'm not even from the United States, but I'm all for the health of boxing worldwide, not just in my neck of the woods. So there's my thoughts on the pay-per-view. But the fight itself, fully expect Andy Ruiz Jr. to win. Even if this guy turns up in the shape he usually turns up, he'll make mincemeat of Chris Arreola, and he'll look good doing it, in my opinion. So the fight is what it is. It's the fight that's been talked about for quite some time. I don't really believe it's a surprise to anybody. And it's now been made official. One further thing to add actually, now this fight is actually on pay-per-view and that has been confirmed, I think Andy Ruiz Jr. not only obviously owes it to himself, but he really owes it to the public to actually work hard and turn up in shape this time. You know, because this is an absolute joke that it's on pay-per-view. The least Andy Ruiz Jr. could do is get in shape and look semi-respectable on the scales and actually give himself a chance in this sport. Let's face facts, Andy Ruiz Jr. has basically fought his whole pro career morbidly obese. And considering that, he's actually achieved quite a lot, made a lot of money, been a unified heavyweight champion, etc. He's done well. But imagine what would happen if this guy actually trained hard, actually turned up in shape. How good could this guy be? Not only does he owe it to himself, but now this sort of fight is on pay-per-view, he really owes it to the fans. Hopefully Eddie Reynoso can actually, kick this guy into gear, and hopefully we see Andy Ruiz Jr. actually take the last few years of his career serious. But there we go. Those are my thoughts on this fight. Share yours below, especially if you're an American fan. How do you feel about this fight being on pay-per-view? Are you actually looking forward to this fight? Share your thoughts below. Peace.